Hi, Rod. Welcome back to 10 by 6.
Hi, thanks very much for having me on again.
Again, our pleasure. This week, we're looking at the pharmaceutical industry. And in the article that you wrote, which this presentation is based on, you identify it as being the industry that commits fraud over and over again, and one of the most corrupt industries on the planet. And the reason why is because right at the heart of it, instead of being an altruistic, community-driven, collective experience, it's very much driven by profit. And we've heard that before, haven't we? Many, many times. Over to you, Rod.
Thanks very much. So I'll begin with a quote like I often do. And I came across an excellent one by a man called Richard Horton, who's editor of The Lancet, which is the leading sort of medical magazine in the UK. And he wrote, "The history of medicine is littered with wonderful early results, which over a period of time turn out to be not so wonderful, or in fact, even adverse. There are a whole string of recent examples where preliminary data led to a lot of excitement and caused changes in clinical practice. And then eventually we realized they had done more harm than good. Why is it that we never learned these lessons?" And I think that's a very, very good summary. And so today we're going to look at sort of half a dozen areas where you'll become aware that the system of drug development doesn't really work properly at all. And so we really need to question how we can change it in the future to make it work better for our societies. So first of all, they research the wrong problems, and everything we're going to talk about, the reason they do the wrong things is because they're pursuing profits. So the international aid organization Médecins Sans Frontières did a study where they pointed out that between 1975 and 2004, out of 1,500 medicines that were developed by the pharmaceutical industry over that period, only 21 of them were for what they call neglected diseases. So that's diseases in poor countries. So the vast majority of medicines are being developed for richer people in advanced nations. So for example, you will be aware that you can now get Viagra, and that has been researched a great deal, but it's much more difficult to get good medicines for things like tuberculosis. So the focus is on lifestyle drugs, which are very profitable in advanced nations, rather than a focus on poorer countries where there would be very little profit. Now, this situation is improving because of things that the WHO, the World Health Organization, have been doing in the last few years, but still it's completely inadequate. Now, another area where there's a big problem is that many of the research costs for new medicines are actually paid for by the government. This is particularly the case in the United States. And one researcher said, the whole ecosystem in which innovation is housed, patents, copyright, finance, universities, research, knowledge transfer, ownership rules, and regulation to ensure common standards, are co-created between the public and the private. But what happens is that at the end of the day, it's private companies that keep the profits from the medicines that they sell. So if you look at a particular example in the United States, the examples are most obvious because they're allowed to charge insane amounts of money for drugs. So there's a drug called Cerezyme, which retails for $200,000 for a year's supply. And this means that many healthcare systems won't actually use it at all because it's just too expensive. So medicines have to be rationed. So they price the medicine not so that it can provide the most benefit to the greatest number of people who will benefit from it, but to maximize their profits. And yet a great deal of the research for that medicine and many others was funded by American universities being paid for by government payments out of taxation. So there should be a question mark about why it is that something that is funded by the government should end up enriching a small number of executives and shareholders who end up owning the patents or controlling the patents for these medicines. So in fact, what a pharmaceutical system should be trying to do is to research the most useful medicines and provide them as cheaply as possible to as many people who will benefit. But in fact, it doesn't do any of those things. And then something that does occasionally get mentioned in the mainstream press is the problems about poor countries having access to medicines or not having access to medicines. And so there's a sort of complex set of international agreements that are overseen by the World Trade Organization, the WTO, that we've talked about a little bit in the past. And that's called TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property. And the idea is that every country that's a member of the WTO is expected to have strong patent laws. And we'll talk about those in more detail on another occasion. Now, with the medicines, there are exceptions built into TRIPS that allow poor countries, in theory, to be able to get medicines cheaply for emergencies. But what turns out to happen in practice is that pressure from rich countries and their companies limits the ability of poor countries to make use of this. There's a very famous example about 20 years ago where AIDS was causing very, very serious problems throughout parts of Africa. Patented AIDS medicines were available for $15,000 a year. Indian companies came along and said they could supply it for just $300 a year, tiny fraction of the cost. But in fact, when Nelson Mandela tried to do that, he was threatened with sanctions by the United States for not enforcing patent rights. So the rules that did exist in the WTO, he was never able to enforce, and millions of people died because of that. So in fact, the system of medical patents is very specifically intended to deprive poor countries of medicines. And it's very interesting that insiders in the system have pointed out that the companies themselves don't really care about what they call poor country markets. Their main goal is to ensure that they keep prices high in rich countries. But they're afraid that if they sell cheaply in poor countries, everybody in rich countries will go, why on earth are we paying so much money for medicines that only cost a tiny fraction of that cost to manufacture? And so they try to insist on very strong patents. Now, if you look at the medicines that do come to market in advanced nations, many of them should be described, this is my phrase, but they are overpriced junk. There is a great deal of research with many of them showing that they are no better than either cheap generic copies that are not patented, or even no better than placebos. That means no better than just a sugar pill that has no real medical value. And in fact, there's a big study carried out by the American NIH, that's the National Institute of Health, where they looked at all the medicines that were used to treat blood pressure. And what they found was that cheap diuretics, which were available for $37 per year, were actually as good as the much more expensive medicines that cost anywhere between $200 and $700 per year. And yet doctors overwhelmingly in the United States were prescribing the expensive medicines. And another aspect of the system that we won't go into too much detail today is the relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and doctors themselves. I'll talk about that a little bit in a couple of minutes. So if you take a specific diabetes drug, let's say there was one that became very notorious called Avandia a few years ago. It's quite ineffective, but it was actually causing large numbers of heart attacks, strokes, and deaths. And there was another drug called Tamiflu, which was stockpiled just over a decade ago about a virus called H1N1. But actually the company that made it, Roche, withheld data to mislead everybody. In fact, the medicine was less effective and more dangerous than they claimed. Now, in fact, it turns out that it's not a crime for Roche to withhold this data. And so what you start to realize is that actually the system allows medical companies, pharmaceutical companies, to commit fraud, what an ordinary person would call fraud, over and over again in marketing these drugs. And one of the things that some researchers have highlighted is that actually these companies are spending more money on marketing these drugs than on research. And we're talking about tens of billions of dollars spent on marketing. Now, one of the interesting things about medicines is that really effective drugs require no marketing at all. When they're introduced, there's a big scientific study which shows clear results. This is reported all over the world. National organizations that oversee the medicines that are used in any country start adding that drug to the list of recommended drugs that doctors should use, and you don't need to spend anything on marketing. The marketing takes care of itself if the drugs are shown to be effective in trials. So when these companies are spending tens of billions of dollars on marketing drugs, they're mostly marketing drugs that actually are not very effective, which to me is an astonishing waste of resources. And one of the more expensive aspects of marketing, again, particularly in the US, is that they actually pay bribes to doctors. And in most countries, that would be illegal. In the US, they can get away with all sorts of incentives that end up going into the pockets of doctors. And then you see other sort of related aspects to the system. So I mentioned earlier on that companies have spent a lot of money researching and manufacturing Viagra. Well, as soon as one company makes a medicine that's shown to be effective and highly profitable, other companies try to create a copycat drug. So it's something that's almost identical, but doesn't infringe copyright. And so competitors to Viagra would include Cialis and Levitra, made by other companies. And these companies then spend huge amounts of money marketing these. And in fact, various researchers have pointed out that if you watch the Super Bowl, then it's as if all the players involved in any year's Super Bowl are taking Viagra, Cialis, and Levitra, because every second advertisement is for one of these medicines. And yet, despite the fact that you've got multiple companies trying to compete against each other to sell the same product, they're not bringing the prices down. They keep the prices high. It's like they have an informal agreement to make sure that they will all make astronomical profits. And then we hinted earlier about the scale of deception that they can get away with. In fact, pharmaceutical industry is one of the most corrupt industries in the world. So it's estimated that they've been fined over $50 billion in the last 20 years. That's an astonishing amount of money. In fact, it's only the financial industry that has higher fines in that period of time in terms of their fraudulent practices. We may have mentioned in an earlier presentation about the weapons industry that is also one of the most corrupt industries in the world. So you've got those three industries, weapons, finance, and pharmaceuticals, so almost competing with each other to be the most corrupt the industry in the world. So in 2012, the pharmaceutical company GlaxoSmithKline, sometimes called GSK, was fined $3 billion in the US for mis-selling drugs. And that included fraud, bribery, overcharging, paying lavish inducements to doctors, covering up negative research evidence, and for making false claims about the medicines. And GSK has also been fined in India, South Africa, and even the UK, which is quite interesting because the UK regulator hardly ever fines anybody for wrongdoing. And that is a slightly unusually high fine of $3 billion. Excuse me. This type of fraud is going on all the time. So these companies have realized that crime pays. The fines are never enough to change their behavior. And in 1997, a group of companies actually got into trouble because they had organized a global price fixing cartel. And so it's very interesting that if you look in the mainstream media, anytime anybody like myself talks about powerful people trying to come up with secret agreements behind the scenes, you're labeled a conspiracy theorist. But actually, this type of behind the scenes agreement to manipulate prices and keep profits high goes on all the time among the most powerful players in many, many industries. So as part of this, the fraud and the deception that goes on, they massively exaggerate the benefits. They massively understate the harms caused by their medicines, and they hide negative results. So consistently, there's been some research showing that medicines tend to be about 4 times more harmful than is actually claimed by the manufacturers. And there have been one or two really extreme cases. So in America, adverse events are believed to hospitalize approximately 2 million people a year. And even in the UK, it's estimated that adverse events from medicines hospitalize approximately 250,000 people each year. So huge numbers of people going to hospital harmed by these medicines, because these medicines are much more dangerous than the manufacturers admit. And there was a famous case with a medicine, a painkiller a few years ago called Vioxx, which killed at least 55,000 people. And again, the manufacturer, Merck, knew that it was dangerous, but they withheld the data. And so you start to realize there's a pattern where, because companies are footing the bill for the large-scale research that is carried out before these drugs come to market, much of the research is heavily biased, and there isn't anybody trying to do anything about the biases in this research. There's a concept we've talked about in previous presentations called regulatory capture, where the regulator of an industry doesn't really think of their role as policing the industry, they see it as enabling the industry. And in fact, the pharmaceutical industry does more lobbying in America, that is bribery, legalized bribery to manipulate politicians, than any other industry. So in 2018, they were paying approximately $280 million to fund politicians in their election campaigns, with the expectation that legislation that benefited them would come their way. And then the main regulator in America is the FDA, that's the Food and Drug Administration, hugely underfunded. They have no long-term safety analysis of medicine. And lots of people have pointed out they have serious conflicts of interest. So the former FDA chief went to work for Pfizer, and then many people in the FDA have backgrounds where they've worked in the big pharmaceutical companies. And in fact, many people from the US Congress, so that's their equivalent of Parliament, they actually, after they finish in Congress, they end up becoming lobbyists for the pharmaceutical industry. So you've got this a huge system of revolving doors backwards and forwards between the industry, the government, and the regulator. Now, I mentioned earlier that those big pharmaceutical companies have received huge fines. Those fines are almost always in the United States. The British regulator, which is called the MHRA, is actually even worse than the American regulator. So they put out a statement in 2012, proudly stating they've given 467 warnings and 151 cautions. I'm not exactly sure what the difference between a warning and a caution is, but it doesn't amount to anything in practice. But the total amount of fines that they had given was just $73,000. You know, that's pounds. So an amount so small that it's completely negligible. And they have never successfully prosecuted a single pharmaceutical company. And yet those companies are often carrying out the same fraudulent or corrupt practices in the United Kingdom as they do in the United States. So when you add all of this together, you start to realize the whole industry is not really fit for purpose. The profit motive is simply corrupting everything. They can make more profit by manipulating the research, lying about benefits and harms, by bribing politicians, by controlling regulators, and so on. So there's no part of the system that actually works as it should. Now, if you think about what a nationally run system might look like, so let's say it was an extension of the NHS, so no profit motive, it could provide the same medicines for a fraction of the price. There would be no copycat drugs, no expensive marketing, no lobbying, no fraud, no legal battles over patents, no depriving poor countries of medicines. So we'd end up with a system that would make effective medicines available as widely as possible and as cheaply as possible. So we need to find a way to create a sort of a drug development system, both domestically and internationally, that will devote significant resources to unprofitable medicines in poor countries, because there's billions of people in other countries who would really benefit from having better medicines, but at the moment they have no access to them. So this is one of those industries where I talk often about how the media do propaganda by doing censorship by omission, that the most important things are not really discussed. So you will never see a discussion in the mainstream media about the possibility of having a state-run pharmaceutical system. It's just so far outside the range of acceptable thought within the mainstream media that it's simply never discussed. And so the existing system, which is, as I've said, completely unfit for purpose, just goes along unchallenged. Okay, I think that's probably quite a good time to take a step back and do a bit of discussion and Q&A.
Wonderful, wonderful, Rod. Thank you so much. Another sort of depressing analysis in health is so central and so core to all humanity, but particularly I think we're conditioned into us now that we need to live as long as possible without really thinking about the implications, because for many people living as long as possible actually means going into care homes, losing the ability to do many things, and obviously the increasing numbers of dementia, Alzheimer's. So it's effectively irrational, I think, for many people to pursue the long life expectancy incentive, given what the last decade, 15, 20 years of some people's lives actually look like. So I think we need to be aware of that as Westerners particularly, because I think our diets, our lifestyles are contributing significantly to poor outcomes. And as I say, I mean poor outcomes, not in terms of mortality rates, but very much in terms of morbidity rates and our quality of life as we near its end. So I think where you have this situation where you have this profitability that's sucked up within the West by keeping prices high at the expense of billions of people living in poor countries, we need to be aware that selfishness that for many people they have ingrained from their conditioning, as well as possibly from nature in some respects, is completely misplaced, because we're probably better off all across the globe living to 70 but having a much higher quality of life than for a demographic in the West to be living to 90 plus, but having to be reliant upon home care or going into care homes or having our loved ones watching us disintegrate before their eyes, so that when we actually die, we're a complete shell of what we were. And the memories often for the family, it takes them a long time to get over the dementia and them not remembering your name and being incapacitated. So I think I just wanted to get that out there as a sort of philosophical notion of us in terms of our obsession with living longer, when actually for many, what is the point?
That's a really good point. In fact, I came across some research a couple of years ago on that, which was saying that if you look at the data, our average life expectancy has increased in the last few decades. And at the time, they were saying over a certain period of time, our life expectancy has increased by about 6 years. But it pointed out that actually of those 6 years, about 1.5 were in reasonable health, but the last 4.5 years were in poor health. Now, I don't know exactly what the definition of poor health was, but it did mean quite bad health. And so I think you're right. We do need to ask this question about whether people really do want to kind of drag on their lifespan year after year after year with ever deteriorating health and so on. And as you say, things like Alzheimer's and so on. It's a really important philosophical question that we do need to wrestle with.
And also, I think it very much crosses over into religion, because if a lot of people who are religious believe that after their death they are going somewhere else, heaven, nirvana, whatever it happens to be, it almost always it seems irrational at the same time to try and cling on to human life. Because if you genuinely believe you're going to go somewhere that's a lot better, why hang around?
That's a good question. I won't really attempt to answer it, but that's given me something to think about.
So let's draw upon some of the brilliant points that you made, and obviously right at the heart of it we have this profit motive. So I've got a question to kick off with, or some questions if you don't mind. When you're charging $200,000 for a drug over a 12-month period, and you talk about these cartels, which we'll come on to, I think, in a moment, in which the prices amongst them are fixed, so that they're not really competing against each other anymore. They're really just trying to maximize their profits. And yet we're also finding that healthcare services across the world, and the NHS obviously is an example, aren't buying these drugs because they're just too expensive. So when they're prioritizing their budgets, they're going elsewhere. And we often read, don't we, in the media about those cases of specific diseases that very small numbers of people have. And the parents are having to crowdfund or beg, in order to find the money in order to either help buy the drug or to be able to fly to a country where that drug is available. And sometimes we also see that the drug is available in Scotland, but it's not available in England. So why don't these companies get together and think, well, if we're not selling very many, the price is too high, we'd actually be better off by reducing the price across the board for this particular drug, hopefully massively increasing supply, and therefore our net markup on each of the times we sell these particular drugs around the world will mean that our profits are raised.
Well, so that's a good question. And I think in order to get a proper answer to that, you'd have to actually get some marketing executives and some accountants in from those companies. Perhaps a retired accountant from a pharmaceutical company would come along and actually explain quite why they are as exploitative as they are. So I have no doubt they're sitting there doing calculations on their expected number of sales and their profits and so on and so on. And often it seems to me that they would probably make more profit if they sold more at a lower price, but for some reason they don't. But I can't give you a good answer to that. I did think that one of the things you said at the beginning part of the question about stuff being available in Scotland and not in England and so on, that you get all of these inconsistencies where different groups of people analyze the costs and benefits and come to different conclusions. And it reminded me of when Michael Moore made this wonderful film. I can't remember which particular film this was where he talked about it, but trying to explain to people in America who can't get healthcare in America, which I think is about 30 million people, that actually if they came over to Cuba, they could get excellent healthcare for free. And
it was called Sicko.
Ah, well done. Okay, yes, you remembered it well. I get confused between the different titles, but you're right. And yeah, it really does seem outrageous that we're still sort of lumbered with so many kind of ridiculous outcomes because profit is sort of central to the functioning of our societies, when in so many industries it would be so much better to remove the profit motive, as Cuba has done with its medical system. Yes,
and I think we mustn't just blame profit. It's also political manipulation and political corruption. That's very much at the heart of it too. You talk about the aim of medical patents designed to shut up poor countries, and the reason why is because you don't want to give the impression to those countries that are paying extortionate amounts for drugs that other countries around the world are getting it a lot cheaper, because it was destabilized, shall we say. But in relation to patents, which I know we're going to look at in a future episode, one of the things that when I taught about the sociology of health some years ago, We looked obviously into why the pharmaceutical industries had these patents. And the general rule was that you had the patent which lasted for 10 years. And the first 5 years were about recouping the costs of the production of the drug and everything that involves, marketing as well. And the second 5 years was about creating your small window of opportunity for making a profit before the patent ran out, and then everybody else could basically have feeding time. So there is, don't get me wrong, I'm not supporting this, I'm just putting the question. There is therefore a logic in this instance to the industry that's spending a lot of money investing in the drug to have that patent. And also, I'm guessing that when it comes to, and I just want to link this question, when it comes to what we call iatrogenesis, which is where the drug's side effects have a harmful effect upon the recipient, upon the patient, it also leads us then to who do we sue? So in this country, can the patient sue the manufacturer directly? Or do they have to sue NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, who sort of certified the drug?
That's a very good question. I can't give you a really authoritative answer. You'd need a sort of patent lawyer or a pharmaceutical industry lawyer to give you the details. So, and I research a number of different countries with many of these things. And so I can never remember exactly what's going on in each country. So, and the rules are different with different types of medicines. So things that are on the childhood vaccination schedule are often treated differently from other medicines and so on. Right. So I can't tell you what the rules are about who to sue. And I know there's been a lot of discussion with the COVID vaccines that in fact the manufacturers have agreements with governments that they cannot be sued, that there is no liability for them. And this is something that is being tested in the courts, because it seems highly likely that, as with all of the other medicines that we've been discussing today, that a great deal of fraud has gone on in terms of claims about the effectiveness and the harms of the vaccines. And so that will all be tested in courts in different countries over the next few years. And it'll be fascinating to see what the outcomes will be. But I think it's interesting when you mention iatrogenesis, that this is something that everybody should be aware of, in terms of the fact that medicines do a lot more harm. People often see in the mainstream media about illegal substances, you know, heroin and cocaine and so on, causing harm. But there's very, very little discussion about the harms caused by legal medicines that you get through the healthcare system. And I think if people were more aware of this, then there'd be much more questioning about the fact that at the moment, if you go to a doctor, pretty much everyone expects to be given a medicine as a kind of magic bullet, as a solution to whatever illness you've got. And doctors have admitted that even when people come to them with viruses, which will not be affected by antibiotics, they will still sometimes give them antibiotics just to make them feel better. And so you realize that we've got this sort of the system of medicine, which is so focused on just giving out pills, that we're not stopping to discuss the much wider issues of lifestyle and health choices and so on, which should be important in everybody's lives.
And given what we know about the effect of antibiotics on our immune system, I would hope that the doctors who give out antibiotics to patients when they don't need them, well, at worst, I guess, struck off, but at best, they will be suspended or cautioned or warned, because frankly, you're destroying the patient's immune system by giving them something like antibiotics in the first place. But if you're giving them for absolutely no medical reason, then that surely is that's something that requires punishment of some form. Whether it's to the practice or whether it's to the individual doctor is another issue.
So that's a really interesting point. And there was actually a documentary on one of the main TV channels a few years ago, where there was a doctor in mainstream practice, and he was trying to encourage other doctors not to give out antibiotics all the time, to be much, much more careful about when they give them, to only give them when people were believed to have bacterial infections, when they might actually be effective and so on.
Absolutely.
And he found it extraordinarily difficult to convince the doctors to do this. And they had all sorts of justifications saying, well, some of the patients get incredibly upset, really angry, actually, aggressively angry. Others, they was saying, well, perhaps what we need to be doing is giving them a placebo pill and things like this, that the patient goes away thinking they've had something. But then of course, you've got all sorts of issues about losing trust with the medical system if people are being given placebos without being told they're given placebos and so on. So I think whilst in theory it sounds easy, I think because we've lived in a society for so long where this has become common practice, yes, and patients expect this, it's probably slightly more difficult in practice to deal with it. I think you could have a few million angry patients threatening receptionists and doctors if you suddenly introduced that rule straight away. So I think it's one of those things where we've kind of created this cultural momentum which makes it challenging to change quickly.
Yeah, in some respects I agree, although of course remember then in all drug trials, often 50% of the drugs that are given out are placebo to see whether the actual drugs that they're testing are working or not in comparative data. So it's happening already. So if you've got, for example, a cancer and you're being given a placebo and your cancer is getting worse and reaches a point of no return, we are effectively through drug trials killing people.
Yes, well, so that's a really, really complex one to answer too. Yes. So with some of these issues, they're quite sort of complex, nuanced debates about, at what point do you say, hang on, you were on the placebo, let's move you into the actual.
But this is the main issue though, isn't it, Rob? Because the patient doesn't know whether they're on the placebo or not. Yes. That decision is done bureaucratically elsewhere because they don't want the patient to know they're on the placebo for obvious reasons.
Yeah, so I think it's a very difficult one to answer because there's a real problem if you start moving lots of people from the placebo group into the main medicine group, and then you don't have a proper sort of research trial which gives you very clear evidence at the end of the day of how effective the medicine was. So I think it's a very tricky ethical issue, and what we've seen with the injections in the last year in relation to COVID is that the trials were never finished because they unblinded them and started giving the injections to people. So we don't have good data on the effectiveness of the vaccines. And I think over the years to come, that will become more and more of a problem if there are long-term harms from the vaccines. So we just don't know that yet. So it's a very tricky one to answer.
And you also need to remember that a lot of these trials are done in poorer countries, and the people who are being tested on, like lab rats, are poor people. It's not the middle class. It's not the wealthy. I mean, if you do drug trials, for example, in this country, often you sign up for it, you fill out all the paper, and you're paid for it. And the side effects of the drug, say, for example, they need to observe you for 2 weeks, you could be paid £800 a day. The problem there, of course, is, as we've seen as well, is that those people who are hard up are much more likely to find this attractive. And the people who aren't hard up, why would they possibly want to do it?
Absolutely. So, I mean, there are so many kind of ethical issues when it comes to medical research. And so you could write a whole other, people write whole books on the subject,
of course they do,
talking in great detail about lots and lots of different studies that have been carried out over the years where there's ethical tripwires everywhere. Yes. And I think when it comes to something like that, there is no single obvious, this is the only way we could possibly do it. There's always kind of pros and cons and trade-offs, and we people have to make decisions. But it should be that when people are discussing those trade-offs, they are informed properly about the trade-offs in order to come to decisions about how these things should take place in the future. Whereas at the moment, there's a real problem that only the senior people within the pharmaceutical companies have the information, and they hide a lot of the information. So other people are not making informed decisions.
No. And if you're the health secretary in this country, or you're Rishi Sunak, or you're Boris Johnson, or whoever, you're not going to sign up for one of these experiments. You're going to take whoever it is to America, and you're going to buy the drug yourself because you can afford to. So for those types of people to be making decisions on our behalf.
Well, so this is something that I think is a fundamental problem with British society and many other societies too, that often the people who are making the key decisions really have no understanding of what life is like for the vast majority of the population. And this is not just politicians and bureaucrats, it's also the judiciary, who are 80% Oxbridge and so on. They don't know what life is like for poorer people, in any real meaningful sense. So that they really, to me, should have no role in judging them. So this is all over our societies, unfortunately.
Yeah, and whenever anybody says the judiciary in this context, always reminds you of that judge. I think it was back in the 80s or 90s, and the Beatles came up in the case, and he didn't know who the Beatles were.
Yeah.
This also, I think, strikes me, Rod, as being a classic example of why no country should turn to insurance-based private medicine. Because as you identified, if you're able to bribe doctors, and doctors then live in their big mansions and big houses, largely based on dark money, and where expensive drugs are either paid for by the wealthy or they're paid for by insurance companies, which therefore have to pass on the premiums to the patients. So the premium gets pushed up considerably higher. And obviously, if you've got a certain condition which requires expensive drugs, your premiums are going to be that much higher than others. So it creates a system, again, that's regressive.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think that's a really good point. And in fact, various people sort of are researching what all the harms that will be caused in the UK if we continue to privatize the healthcare system. And the sort of example that people always look at is the American system, which is very, very privatized. And what they see is all sorts of treatments that people don't receive because the insurance company doesn't want to pay out for it, even though their insurance company is meant to cover that treatment. But then all sorts of other tests and treatments that people don't need, that somebody is making a profit from somewhere by doing those tests and those treatments. And so you start to see that in America, doctors are consistently among the highest paid. They're all millionaires and so on, the ones who work exclusively in the private sector. And you realize again that as with the pharmaceutical industry, there are just so many perverse incentives. And in fact, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, there's a very famous recording of a conversation between Richard Nixon and one of his advisors. So this is going back 60 odd years now. And they were discussing whether or not America should have something similar to a national health service as we have in European countries and Britain and so on. And his advisor said, well, the great thing about privatizing healthcare is that all of the incentives point in the wrong direction. And based on this, they actually went with a private system. So the idea is that if you've got a profit motive, there will be fraud and corruption all over the place in the healthcare system, and some groups of people will get very, very rich from it. So yeah. I agree with you entirely that all the research evidence shows that by far the best way to run a healthcare system cost effectively and provide good outcomes for the whole population is to have a national health service.
Just briefly, we talked about it earlier, this whole essence of a so-called profit-based system that is effectively a load of very wealthy pharmaceutical corporations forming a monopoly via cartels. So yet again, it reinforces your argument that you made in other episodes, that we simply don't have, and actually, in actual fact, also, we don't desire, it's just a lip service, we don't desire free markets.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the interesting thing. You know, everybody who studies mainstream economics and everybody who reads the press, you see the term free markets bandied about all the time, and it's unquestioningly accepted that this is the way to go. In fact, the real world isn't free markets. It is about powerful companies, so monopolies where one is dominant, oligopolies where three or four are dominant, and they fix their prices, they overcharge, they rip off suppliers, and so on. And we've talked about all of these things before, but that is how the world works in this day and age, unfortunately. And even mainstream US kind of commentators, so people like Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz, who write in the mainstream press in the US, and they've had very senior policy roles within governments, even they are starting to say, this is a problem. It is harming our societies. It is causing more and more inequality. And we really do have to change the system.
Yeah, absolutely. We touched on this, just a very last point now, we touched on iatrogenesis and the data that you stated, 250,000 hospitalizations as a result of the side effects of drugs, 10 times that in the US, and that the MHRA, the regulator in this country, is no better than a bar of soap in boiling hot water. And as you also pointed out, just to finish off, it's probably one of the most important points that we have to make, and yet it creates a problem for those people, therefore, who turn to medicine when they are sick. Because I guess one of the arguments could be, Rod, is that if we maintain and try and promote this idea that the patient needs to be fully aware, we also have to recognize that the patient can never be fully aware. In fact, even saying that they're partially aware sometimes is an overestimation because of the level of understanding that you would have to have in pharmacology and medicine, etc., more generally. So there is an argument, I guess, that in going back to previous conversations about ethics and the patient's democratic rights, is that we could lead for people to not go to the doctor. We could lead to people to prematurely die by giving them information which means they become cynical and suspicious of our healthcare system. I'm not saying that we don't do it. I'm saying we would need to completely radically reform the education system and the nature of our societies, and much more participatory democracy, and encouraging people to just learn. But we're not anywhere near that. And because we're not anywhere near that, we could do more harm than good.
So that's possibly true. And I think it's a sort of, whenever you talk about where we would like to be in the future, it's always a tricky one. So with us, our societies and our understanding of science is now very complex. That's not to say we have a really good understanding of how the human body works. We don't, but it's still very, very kind of advanced and specialized. And so you have doctors are specializing in ever smaller kind of parts of understanding the body and so on. Yes. And so you do have to have a situation ultimately where the patient accepts that they can never know everything about what's going on with their bodies. And so you sort of hand over authority to a doctor. Yes. But I think doctors do also need to communicate back to the patients about sort of possible risks and harms and downsides and so on. And for people to be able to interpret that meaningfully, they do probably require an altogether higher level of general understanding of many of these issues. So it would be a huge revamp of our education systems.
Yes. And of course, doctors are under so much more pressure now, and many doctors are leaving the profession. And therefore, it's making it even more difficult to cater for the increasing demand of patient care. So we have that major issue as well. And for many patients, sometimes they're lucky if they get a 4-minute appointment. And it's basically what can I do for you? Quick look at the data on the screen, conclusion, out of here, type up notes, next. in terms of a much more qualitative, holistic approach to healthcare, we seem to be moving away from that much more than we are moving closer.
Yeah, well, I think it's a deliberate strategy on the part of the government, that a bit like with the railways in the past, that if they deliberately underfund it so everybody thinks, oh, it's rubbish, then more and more people will choose a private alternative. And I'm sure it's a deliberate strategy. So it just requires a completely different mindset from our politicians, who actually believe in the concept of a proper functioning national healthcare service, rather than their current sort of steady drift of privatization.
And to finish off, the immortal phrase, privatization by stealth.
Yeah, well, I think so. And so I think it's very interesting. You know, I remember chatting to a doctor a few years ago, and he's saying, oh, I don't really think there's much privatization in the healthcare system. But then, you know, you start going through the different departments that have been privatized. And it started out with the sort of non-medical things, so it would be the catering or the cleaning and so on. But then it's the doctors who look at your scans on the computers. Well, they can be based in Australia and still looking at the same scan on a computer. So that's an outsourced private company these days, and so on. And you start to realize actually that more and more of it is being privatized.
Yes, and of course, many of these doctors also, especially living in the cities, but not just in the cities, but in large towns, will push up their incomes dramatically by also working in the private sector.
Oh yeah, there's so much to, if we're going to do the health service, we could sort of be talking all day about the bizarre situation. And so I've known a few doctors personally, and they'll say, well, there's this other kind of consultant, so one of the top doctors, and he does a little bit in the National Health Service, but he also has his private practice. But when he's doing the private practice stuff, well, he's using all the facilities that come from the NHS and so on, and it's an entirely exploitative relationship.
Absolutely. And just to really finish off, I don't know if you've seen This Is Going to Hurt with Ben Whishaw.
I have, yes.
Fabulous. And there's one particular episode where he works in a private hospital, and of course what he realizes is that the NHS looks after the complex stuff. If anything goes wrong in a private hospital, the first thing they do is they get you in a state-funded or a private ambulance, and they ship you to the nearest NHS hospital because they haven't got the resources and the capacity to cope.
Yeah, so this is the very interesting thing. Once people start to understand that the sort of profit motive in the private part of the system causes them to want to cut costs and cut costs and cut costs where they can get away with it, but then they offload those costs onto the state-run part of the system where it's necessary. And in fact, you see an exact parallel in the United States with the privatization of prisons. So they tried to privatize some prisons. What they realized is, because in the private prisons, they're so focused on profit, they don't want to train the staff properly. They don't want to have enough staff to cope with the more difficult prisoners. The challenging prisoners get moved back into the state-run system where they train the staff properly and they have enough of them. And then the private sector just hangs on to all of those prisoners who are very easy to look after because they never cause any trouble and so on. And you start to realize there is this massive subsidy. It's not kind of listed as a subsidy anywhere in any document, but it's this massive subsidy by the government of private systems, and it's in healthcare, and it's in prisons, and it's everywhere else. And again, it's something that we need to be talking about much more seriously.
Absolutely. The heart of it is profit. Thank you so much, Rod. Fantastic.
My pleasure.
So interesting and so informative. See you next week.
See you next week. Cheerio.